On the morning of November 29, 1943, at precisely 11:32, a young farm boy from Wisconsin found himself in the most precarious position imaginable. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran, barely 19 years old, sat alone in the tail section of a B-17 flying fortress designated as Rikki-Tikki-Tavi, watching swarms of German fighters approach his aircraft with lethal intent. This would be his inaugural combat mission over one of Germany's most heavily fortified industrial targets. The 8th Air Force had dispatched more than 300 bombers that morning with orders to obliterate the manufacturing facilities in Bremen. German air defenses had already claimed 6 flying fortresses within the first 60 minutes of the operation. Moran occupied the most isolated station aboard the entire aircraft. The tail gunner's position placed him at the extreme rear of the bomber, separated from his 9 crewmates by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. His sole companions were twin 50-caliber machine guns and the enemy pilots determined to destroy him. The B-17's crew complement consisted of 10 airmen distributed throughout the aircraft. The pilot and co-pilot commanded from the cockpit, while the navigator and bombardier worked in the nose section. A flight engineer operated the top turret, and the radio operator maintained communications from behind the bomb bay. 2 waist gunners manned open window positions on either side of the fuselage, while the ball turret gunner hung suspended beneath the aircraft in a glass sphere. Moran alone occupied the tail, tasked with a single critical responsibility: defending the bomber's most vulnerable approach angle. German pilots had discovered early in the conflict that attacking a B-17 directly from behind positioned them within the firing arc of only one defender, the tail gunner. By November 1943, the 8th Air Force was experiencing catastrophic attrition rates. The Schweinfurt mission 2 months prior had resulted in the loss of 60 flying fortresses in a single operation, 600 men killed or captured in one afternoon. Bomber crews had developed their own grim terminology for deep penetration missions into Germany, calling them milk runs to hell. The mathematics governing survival were utterly unforgiving. Bomber crews needed to complete 25 missions before earning rotation home. Statistical analysis revealed that the average crew survived only 15 missions. Certain groups were losing half their aircraft strength every month. Moran had enlisted immediately upon reaching his 18th birthday, having grown up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. He had observed aircraft passing overhead throughout his childhood and harbored dreams of aviation. The Army Air Forces desperately needed aerial gunners, young men possessing quick reflexes and steady nerves, preferably farm boys already familiar with marksmanship. Gunnery training had taught him to track rapidly moving targets while compensating for wind conditions, altitude variations, and his own aircraft's velocity. He learned to fire in controlled bursts to prevent barrel overheating. He memorized the distinctive silhouettes of German fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190. He could identify these aircraft at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. However, no amount of training could adequately prepare anyone for the reality of aerial combat over Germany. The temperature at 24,000 feet plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency. The thin atmosphere made every movement exhausting, and German fighters attacked in successive waves, firing 20-millimeter cannons capable of shredding aluminum airframes like paper. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi had departed from Snetterton Heath in England that morning as part of the 96th Bomb Group. The designation was Bremen, an industrial city situated on the Weser River, containing shipyards, aircraft manufacturing facilities, and submarine pens, one of the most heavily defended urban centers in all of Germany. The bomber formations had crossed the North Sea in tight defensive boxes, with each B-17 positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The tactical theory was straightforward: pack the bombers closely together so their combined firepower could repel enemy fighters. The reality proved that a direct hit on one aircraft frequently damaged those flying in close proximity. Bremen's anti-aircraft defenses commenced firing as the formations approached their target. Black bursts of flak saturated the sky. The bombers could not take evasive action. They were required to maintain straight and level flight during the bomb run. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages with devastating effect. Moran observed a B-17 in the formation ahead receive a direct hit. The aircraft folded in half and dropped from the sky. Rikki-Tikhovi released its ordnance over the target zone. 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbled toward the factories below. The primary mission objective had been accomplished. Now they merely had to survive the return flight to England. The bomber formation began its turn toward home. 200 miles of hostile airspace separated them from safety. At that moment, Rikki-Tikhovi's No. 2 engine received a direct hit from flak. The propeller windmilled uselessly as the aircraft began losing airspeed. A damaged bomber falling behind its formation represented a death sentence. German fighter pilots actively searched for stragglers. A lone B-17 without the protection of concentrated defensive fire became easy prey. Moran detected them approaching, a dozen Messerschmitts climbing from below, with another group of Focke-Wulfs diving from above. Rikki-Tikhovi was about to engage alone against overwhelming odds. Positioned in the tail gunner station, Eugene Moran would become their primary target. The first Messerschmitts attacked from the 6 o'clock low position, directly behind and beneath the bomber. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate behind him and engaged his triggers. His twin .50 calibers roared to life, sending tracer rounds streaking toward the fighter. The German pilot broke off his attack and rolled away, but more fighters were approaching, many more. The Focke-Wulfs attacked in coordinated pairs. One would draw the gunner's attention while the other maneuvered for a killing shot. Moran swung his guns from target to target as spent brass casings accumulated around his knees. The acrid smell of cordite filled his cramped compartment. At 24,000 feet, the temperature inside Rikki-Tikhovi measured 43 degrees below zero. Moran wore an electrically heated flight suit, yet the cold still penetrated. His breath formed ice crystals on his oxygen mask. The machine guns grew hot from continuous firing, while his fingers went numb inside his gloves. The German pilots were experienced professionals, Luftwaffe veterans who had been in combat since 1939. They understood precisely how to destroy a B-17. Target the engines first, forcing a bomber with damaged power plants to fall behind its formation. Then systematically eliminate the gunners and their defensive fire. Finally, pour cannon rounds into the fuselage until something vital failed. Moran heard the impacts before he felt them. 20mm cannon shells punched through aluminum with the distinctive sound of tearing metal. Somewhere forward, one waist gunner ceased firing, then the other. The intercom filled with static and fragmented voices. Moran could not determine who was speaking or what they were attempting to communicate. The bomber shuddered as additional rounds struck home. He continued firing. There existed nothing else he could do. A Focke-Wulf approached from the 4 o'clock position. Moran swung his guns and pressed the triggers. The fighter's wing disintegrated as it spiraled downward, trailing black smoke, his first confirmed kill. He had no time to acknowledge this achievement. Cannon rounds ripped through the tail section. Moran felt something impact his left forearm, then his right. Both arms had been struck. Blood soaked through his flight suit sleeves. The pain arrived immediately and intensely, but his hands retained function. He could still grip the triggers. Additional impacts followed. The vertical stabilizer above him absorbed multiple hits. Cables snapped and whipped through the air. The tail section began vibrating violently. Something fundamental was failing within the aircraft structure. Moran glanced down at his parachute. Every airman wore one, the silk canopy packed into a canvas container strapped to his chest. If the bomber went down, the parachute represented his only chance of survival. He observed multiple holes in the fabric. Cannon rounds had shredded it completely. His parachute was rendered useless. If he needed to bail out, he would fall 4 miles to certain death. The attack persisted. German fighters made repeated passes. Moran counted at least 15 circling the crippled bomber. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi was bleeding altitude and airspeed. The remaining engines strained to keep the aircraft airborne. Forward, in the nose section, navigator Jesse Orison remained alive, wounded but conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were both deceased at the controls. The aircraft engineer was dead in his turret. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. The waist gunners were dead. Of the 10 men who had departed England that morning, only 2 still breathed. Orison in the nose, Moran in the tail. 40 feet of shattered fuselage separated them. Another cannon round struck the bomber, hitting something critical. Moran felt the aircraft lurch violently. A grinding sound echoed through the airframe. The vibration intensified until his teeth rattled. Then came a sound he would never forget. The shriek of tearing aluminum, the scream of structural failure. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi was breaking apart. The fuselage split just forward of the tail section. Moran watched the front portion of the aircraft separate and fall away. The wings, the engines, the cockpit, the bodies of his crewmates, all of it tumbling toward the German countryside 4 miles below. He was alone now, trapped in a severed tail section with wounds to both arms, his parachute destroyed, 24,000 feet above enemy territory, falling. The laws of physics offered no clemency. Terminal velocity for a human body approximates 120 miles per hour. The tail section of a B-17 weighed several thousand pounds and would fall faster, considerably faster. Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds remaining to live. The severed tail section tumbled through the sky, spinning end over end, throwing Moran against the walls of his compartment. His wounded arms produced excruciating pain. Blood sprayed across the interior surfaces. Wind howled through the torn fuselage where the rest of the aircraft had been attached. Moran should have been paralyzed with terror. He should have curled into a defensive position and awaited death. Instead, he did something that defied all rational logic. He continued fighting. The German fighters were still circling. They observed the tail section falling and moved in for a closer examination. Perhaps they wanted to confirm the kill. Perhaps curiosity motivated them. Whatever their reasoning, they made a critical error. They flew within range of a wounded tail gunner who refused to accept death. Moran grabbed his machine guns. The spinning tail section made accurate aiming nearly impossible. G-forces pressed him against his seat, then threw him toward the ceiling. His arms were bleeding profusely. His parachute was destroyed. He was falling 4 miles to certain death, and he was still shooting. Tracers arced wildly through the sky as the tail section rotated. The German pilots scattered in confusion. They had never witnessed anything like this. A man in a falling coffin returning fire with everything available to him. One Messerschmitt took hits across its fuselage. The pilot broke off and dove toward the ground, trailing smoke. The altimeter in the tail section was shattered, but Moran could observe the ground growing larger through gaps in the torn metal. Fields, forests, roads, a patchwork of German farmland rushing upward to meet him. The tail section's aerodynamics became his salvation. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers functioned like crude wings, catching the air and creating drag. Instead of plummeting straight down, the wreckage began to glide. The spinning decelerated. The descent became almost controlled. Almost. Moran estimated he was falling at approximately 100 feet per second, fast enough to kill him on impact, but slower than a human body in free fall. The stabilizers were purchasing time, seconds, perhaps a minute, time he utilized to continue firing at any German fighter that approached. The ground was 5,000 feet below, then 3,000, then 1,000. Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate, wrapping his wounded arms around ammunition boxes. There existed nothing else to secure himself to. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at approximately 100 miles per hour. The impact snapped branches as thick as a man's arm. The vertical stabilizer caught on a trunk and tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding pieces of aluminum with each impact. Moran's head slammed into the steel framework above him. His vision exploded into white light. He felt his ribs crack. Both arms bent at angles they were never designed to achieve. The tail section struck another tree, spun sideways, and crashed into the frozen ground. Then silence. Eugene Moran was alive, barely. He lay in the wreckage, unable to move. Both forearms were broken in multiple places, compound fractures with bone protruding through skin. His ribs were shattered. Every breath brought stabbing pain. Blood poured from a wound on his head where a piece of his skull had been torn away, partially exposing his brain to the freezing air. The crash site was located in a forest near the German town of Syke, 15 miles south of Bremen, deep in enemy territory. Moran was surrounded by people who had just witnessed American bombs destroy their factories and kill their neighbors. He attempted to move. His legs responded weakly. His arms were useless. The cold was already seeping into his body. Hypothermia would claim him within hours if his wounds did not kill him first. Moran crawled toward the opening where the tail section had separated from the aircraft. Each movement sent waves of agony through his broken body. He pulled himself onto the frozen ground and looked up at the gray German sky. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a functional parachute, one of only 3 men in the entire war who would accomplish this extraordinary feat. But survival meant nothing if he bled to death in a German forest. Voices echoed through the trees, German voices. Soldiers were coming to investigate the crash site. They would discover an American airman with catastrophic injuries, an enemy combatant, someone who had just bombed their city. What they would do with him remained entirely uncertain. The German soldiers emerged from the trees with rifles raised, surrounding the wreckage and staring at the American lying in the snow. One shouted orders, another ran back toward the road, presumably to summon an officer. Moran could not resist. He could not fight. He could barely breathe. The soldiers searched him roughly, ignoring his screams of pain as they moved his shattered arms. They found his dog tags, his rank insignia, his ruined parachute. They left him lying on the frozen ground while they examined the tail section. An officer arrived within the hour, looked at Moran's wounds, and shook his head. The American was clearly dying. Transporting him anywhere seemed pointless, but orders were orders. Downed airmen were to be captured and interrogated if possible. Dead airmen provided no intelligence. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart without stretcher, blankets, or medical attention. The cart bounced along frozen roads for what felt like hours. Every jolt sent fresh agony through his broken ribs and fractured arms. The wound on his skull had stopped bleeding only because the cold had frozen the blood into a dark crust. The cart delivered him to a German military facility. Moran could not identify what type. His vision blurred. Consciousness came and went in waves. He remembered being carried inside, lying on a concrete floor, German voices discussing him as if he were already a corpse. No doctor came, no medic, no one offered water, bandages, or morphine. The Germans had limited medical supplies and were not about to waste them on an enemy airman who would probably die anyway. Moran lay on that concrete floor for 2 days. His wounds became infected. The exposed brain tissue began to swell. His broken arms turned purple and black. Gangrene was setting in. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without antibiotics, the infection would spread to his bloodstream. Without intervention, he had perhaps 48 hours to live. The German guards watched him deteriorate. Some seemed indifferent. Others appeared almost sympathetic, but none possessed the authority or resources to save him. American bombers had been destroying German cities for months. Medical supplies were scarce. Doctors were overwhelmed with German casualties. Enemy airmen ranked far below German soldiers and civilians on the priority list. On the 3rd day, Moran was transported again, another cart, another agonizing journey over frozen roads. This time, his destination was a prisoner of war hospital, a converted building somewhere in occupied territory, where wounded Allied airmen were held until they recovered enough to be sent to permanent camps. The hospital was understaffed and undersupplied. German military doctors performed triage on incoming prisoners. Those with survivable wounds received treatment. Those deemed beyond saving were left to die. Moran's injuries placed him firmly in the 2nd category. But the hospital held a secret. Among the prisoners were 2 Serbian doctors, military physicians captured on the Eastern Front. They had been pressed into service treating wounded prisoners of war, performing surgeries with inadequate equipment and almost no anesthesia. The Germans allowed this because it freed their own doctors for more important patients. The Serbian doctors examined Moran and made a decision. They would attempt to save him, not because anyone ordered them to, not because they had the proper tools or medications, simply because he was a wounded man and they were physicians. The surgery lasted 7 hours. They worked with instruments designed for field operations. No proper anesthesia, only local numbing agents that barely dulled the pain. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness as they set his broken bones with metal pins and wire. They cleaned infected tissue from his wounds. They removed bone fragments from his skull and covered the exposed brain with what tissue they could salvage. The Serbian doctors attached a metal plate to Moran's head. Crude by modern standards, effective enough to keep him alive. They splinted his arms with wooden boards and wrapped them in bandages torn from sheets. They did everything possible with almost nothing available. When the surgery concluded, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would determine whether he lived or died. His body had to fight off the remaining infection. His bones had to begin healing. His brain had to avoid further swelling. There was nothing more they could do. Eugene Moran's survival now depended entirely on his own will to live. The fever came on the first night. Moran's temperature climbed to 104 degrees. His body shook with violent chills despite sweat pouring from his skin. The Serbian doctors monitored him as closely as their limited resources allowed. They changed his bandages. They forced water between his cracked lips. They waited. Infection was the great killer in military hospitals. Antibiotics existed but were almost impossible to obtain in a German prisoner of war facility. The doctors had cleaned Moran's wounds as thoroughly as they could, but bacteria had already entered his bloodstream. His immune system was fighting a war inside his own body. The second night was worse. Moran slipped into delirium. He called out for his mother. He screamed warnings to crewmates who were already dead. He relived the moment when Ricky Tikki-Tavi broke apart, his unconscious mind replaying the trauma repeatedly. The other wounded prisoners in the hospital ward listened to his ravings and wondered if he would see morning. The Serbian doctors took turns sitting with him. They had no medicine to offer, only their presence. Only cold cloths pressed against his burning forehead, only whispered encouragement in accented English that he probably could not hear. On the third morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes and recognized his surroundings for the first time in days. He was alive. The infection had not killed him. His body had won the battle that medicine could not fight. The Serbian doctors examined his wounds and found the first signs of healing. The tissue around his skull plate was beginning to close. The broken bones in his arms were starting to knit together. Recovery would require months, perhaps years. The damage to his body was extensive. But Eugene Moran was going to survive. Word spread through the hospital about the American who fell 4 miles without a parachute, the tail gunner who kept shooting as his bomber disintegrated around him, the man who should have died a dozen times but refused to stop breathing. German guards came to observe him. Other prisoners asked to hear his story. Even the hospital administrators seemed impressed by his impossible survival. The Serbian doctors had saved his life, but they could not protect him forever. Once Moran was stable enough to travel, he would be transferred to a permanent prisoner of war camp. The hospital was only a way station, a place where wounded men were patched together before being sent into the German POW system. 6 weeks after the crash, Moran could walk again. His arms remained in splints. The metal plate in his skull caused constant headaches. His ribs ached with every breath. But he was mobile, he was conscious, he was ready for transfer. The Germans processed him with bureaucratic efficiency: name, rank, serial number, service branch, unit assignment. They photographed him for their records, a thin young man with hollow cheeks and bandaged arms, staring into the camera with eyes that had seen too much. His first permanent camp was Stalag Lut 4 in Pomerania, a compound specifically designed to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences, guard towers with machine guns, wooden barracks that offered little protection against the brutal Eastern European winter. Thousands of American and British airmen filled the camp: pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, men who had been shot down over Germany and occupied Europe. Some had been prisoners for years, others had arrived only weeks before Moran. All of them shared the same fate: captivity until the war ended, or they died. Moran found a strange community behind the wire. Prisoners organized themselves into units. They maintained military discipline. They created libraries from donated books. They held classes in everything from mathematics to foreign languages. They built secret radios to monitor BBC broadcasts. They planned escapes that rarely succeeded. The camp provided minimal rations: thin soup, black bread, occasionally potatoes or turnips. Red Cross packages supplemented the diet when they arrived, but deliveries were unpredictable. Most prisoners lost 20 or 30 pounds during their captivity. Some lost more. Moran's body continued healing. His arms regained function, though they would never be as strong as before. The headaches from his skull injury became less frequent. The nightmares about the crash never stopped. He was alive, he was surviving, but 17 months of captivity still stretched ahead of him, and the worst was yet to come. In the summer of 1944, the Germans transferred Moran to a new facility. The journey took him across occupied Poland in a cattle car packed with 60 prisoners. No room to sit, no sanitation, no food for 3 days. Men collapsed against each other and prayed for the train to stop. The destination was another camp, then another. Over the following months, Moran passed through 4 different POW facilities as the Germans shuffled prisoners across their shrinking empire. Each transfer brought new hardships, new guards, new diseases, new ways to suffer. The worst came in the autumn of 1944, the Hell Ship. German authorities decided to move several hundred Allied prisoners across the Baltic Sea. The vessel was an aging freighter never designed to carry human cargo. Guards forced the prisoners into the hold below deck, a dark metal cavern with no ventilation, no sanitation, and no space to move. Moran descended into that hold with 200 other men. The hatch closed above them. The ship began to move, and the nightmare began. The hold was completely dark. Prisoners could not see their own hands. They could only hear groaning, coughing, retching, men suffering from dysentery who could not reach the single bucket designated as a latrine. The stench became unbearable within hours. The crossing lasted 4 days. Prisoners died in that hold. Their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. Men went mad from the darkness and the smell and the constant rolling of the ship. They screamed, they fought, they prayed. Some simply stopped responding and had to be checked for pulse to determine if they were still alive. When the hatch finally opened, Moran climbed out into gray daylight with eyes that had forgotten how to see. His clothes were soaked with filth. His body had shed more weight it could not afford to lose. The metal plate in his skull throbbed with pain that never fully subsided. The Hell Ship delivered its surviving cargo to another camp in Prussia. More barbed wire, more guard towers, more thin soup and black bread, and more waiting for a war that seemed like it might never end. But the war was ending. By January 1945, Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied armies were pushing from the west. Germany was being crushed between 2 unstoppable forces. The prisoners could hear distant artillery. They could see German guards growing nervous. Something was about to change. On February 6, 1945, the change came. Soviet troops were approaching the camp. German commanders ordered an immediate evacuation. All prisoners would march west on foot. Destination unknown, duration unknown. Refusal meant execution. The prisoners assembled in the frozen compound. Temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Many men had no winter coats, no gloves, no proper boots. They had been surviving on starvation rations for months, and now they were expected to walk across Germany in the coldest winter in decades. The column stretched for miles, thousands of Allied airmen trudging through snow and ice. German guards marched alongside with rifles ready. Anyone who fell behind would be shot. Anyone who tried to escape would be shot. The message was clear: walk or die.